Three Amish brothers vanished after going to market. 11 years later, their hats are found in a stranger's barn. What happened to them? You must join our channel and hit subscribe, because only those who seek truth buried in silence will do it before this story begins. Amos King's boots crunched softly on the frost-hardened earth as he made his way toward Levi Wren's barn. The morning air sharp and cold enough to bite at exposed skin. The sun had just broken over the distant fields, casting a pale golden light across the farmhouses and rolling farmland that stretched beyond the horizon. A restless wind stirred the branches of the old oaks lining the property, sending brittle leaves fluttering to the ground like forgotten memories. Amos's breath came in shallow clouds, his eyes narrowing against the chill as he reached the barn door. It hung slightly ajar, creaking on its rusted hinges as the wind pushed it back and forth. He frowned, uneasy at the sight. Levi was a quiet man, never one to leave things open or unattended, especially his barn, where his horses and tools were kept safe. Amos stepped closer, the scent of damp wood and horses mingling with the cold morning air. Peering inside, his heart caught in his throat. 3 straw hats hung neatly on the far wall, nailed in a row. The shapes were unmistakable, wide-brimmed, worn by countless sunrises and sunsets, faded with use but cared for. Each hat bore a name, carefully carved into the brim's edge: ES, AS, and MS. The initials sent a sharp pang through Amos's chest. Elijah, Abram, Micah, the Stoltz brothers. His fingers twitched as if to reach out and touch the hats, but he stopped himself, his skin prickling with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. The air around the hats felt different, heavier, colder, like a hollow space inside his chest had opened up and filled with winter's chill. I swear, the air around those hats was colder than winter, he later told his apprentice, voice low and trembling with something between fear and disbelief. But now, standing alone in the dim light of the barn, Amos's mind raced faster than his pounding heart. Why here? Why now? The hats should have been gone, scattered like ashes to the wind. 11 years had passed since the Stoltz brothers vanished, leaving behind only whispers and unanswered questions. Their wagon abandoned, their horses missing, and no sign of struggle to explain their sudden disappearance.
No bones, no trace.
Just those worn hats, and now here they were. Amos's hands shook as he lifted the heavy hammer, but the usual steady rhythm, the one that had made him one of Fairhollow's most respected blacksmiths, escaped him completely. Each strike fell erratic and uneven, metal sparking at odd angles on the anvil. His apprentice, a boy barely 16, watched silently from the corner, sensing something was wrong but saying nothing. The straw hats pinned on the barn wall gnawed at Amos's thoughts, their silence louder than any clanging iron. He had stared at them all day, unable to shake the chill curling deep inside his chest. The initials, S, and MS, each carved sharply and neatly, in the same familiar hand Jonas Stoltz had used to mark every tool, every piece of furniture his boys ever touched. Amos knew those marks because he had seen them 100 times, in every workshop and barn in Fairhollow. The detail was unmistakable. These hats were not ordinary. They were a message. But from whom? And why had Levi Wren, a man nobody really knew, brought them here? Amos wiped his brow, feeling sweat bead under the heavy leather apron despite the chill outside. His mind wrestled with questions, doubts fighting hope. Maybe Levi had purchased the hats at a market sale or found them forgotten. Maybe the initials were a strange coincidence, carved by someone else, or perhaps a prank. But no, something about the scene, the neatness, the cold air Amos had felt hovering near those hats, made his skin crawl. It wasn't just the hats. It was the silence, the unnatural stillness that settled over the Clemens farm once Levi took residence. By late afternoon, the sun had dipped low behind the tall oaks lining the edge of town. Amos closed his shop early, the noise of hammer and fire replaced by the soft creak of wagon wheels and the distant calls of roosters settling in for the night. He wrapped his thick hands in a wool cloth and set off toward the small cottage of Silas Glick, the town's elder and former bishop. Silas was a man whose age had carved deep lines into his face but left his mind sharp as a blade. Amos needed advice, guidance, and, if possible, reassurance. Silas's home smelled of old wood and pipe smoke, the air thick with quiet wisdom. Amos found him seated by the fire, eyes closed, hands folded over a worn Bible. At the sound of Amos's footsteps, Silas opened his eyes, their color piercing in the dim room. Without preamble, Amos spoke. "I saw them, Silas. 3 hats hanging in Levi Wren's barn. Straw just like the Stoltz boys wore. Each one marked, carved with initials. The same hand. Yes, AS, and MS." Silas's eyes narrowed, and he leaned back slowly, exhaling a long sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. "That farm's cursed," he said quietly, voice heavy with the past. "Old Clemens was a drunkard, and his boy vanished the year after the Stoltz brothers disappeared. You're telling me there are hats in that barn with names carved the same as them?" Amos nodded, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "It's true. I wouldn't bring it to you otherwise." Silas stood and moved toward the fireplace, retrieving a thick leather-bound book of town records. The firelight flickered on the worn pages as he flipped through, fingers tracing lines of faded ink until he stopped at a section near the end. His finger tapped the page deliberately. The Clemens place was one of the last stops before the market. If someone wanted to make them disappear, that's where they'd start. His voice was low, edged with a tremor of warning. Amos felt the room close in around him. The gravity of the discovery was sinking like cold stone in his gut. "Should we confront Levi? Ask him about the hats?" His voice was tentative, uncertain. Silas shook his head firmly, eyes locking on Amos's. "Not yet. We watch. We listen. But you keep this to yourself, understand? Word will spread fast, and the town isn't ready for answers. Especially not yet." Amos swallowed hard and nodded. "I understand." The walk back home was slow, each step weighted with tension. The twilight deepened into a navy blue sky, stars beginning to pierce the darkness. As Amos passed the Stoltz homestead, the window caught his eye. Jonas Stoltz stood there, a dark silhouette against the dim interior light. The familiar figure, usually surrounded by the soft glow of candles, was still, too still. The usual trio of flickering flames was absent. A chill traced Amos's spine as he whispered to the night, almost like he already knew. Amos crouched low behind the stacked hay bales, his breath shallow and steady, trying not to betray the rapid pounding of his heart. Across the field, Levi Wren moved with a quiet purpose, the soft thud of his boots muffled by the thick grass. Amos's eyes never left the man as he stepped out of the dense woods, carrying a basket covered by a worn cloth. But something about the way Levi held it caught Amos off guard. It wasn't the casual grip of a farmer carrying food. It was a careful, almost reverent cradling, like a father holding a sleeping child. The basket seemed heavier than it should have been. A chill ran down Amos's spine. Levi glanced over his shoulder once, eyes sharp beneath a mop of unruly hair, as if sensing unseen eyes on him. Amos's muscles tensed, fingers gripping the rough wood of the hay bale for support. Levi's steps were deliberate, slow, cautious, and when he reached the far edge of the barnyard, he hesitated before lowering the basket to the ground. Then, with practiced ease, he opened a rusted metal door, half hidden under a tangle of moss and thick brush. The door creaked a warning as it swung open, revealing the gaping blackness of a cellar beneath the earth. Levi stepped inside and the door groaned shut behind him, swallowing the faint light from above. Amos waited, every second stretching thin like a snapped wire. The cool wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint scents of damp earth and decaying leaves. But the barnyard felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. 30 minutes passed with only the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant crow breaking the silence. Amos's knees ached from crouching, but his gaze never wavered from the cellar entrance. Finally, the door eased open again and Levi emerged, basket gone, his face unreadable beneath the low brim of his hat. He glanced around nervously before retreating into the shadows of the barn. Amos waited a moment, then crept forward, heart hammering loud enough to drown out reason. His hand trembled as he reached for the cold metal handle of the cellar door. The moment he touched it, a faint noise stopped him. Something inside shifted with a slow, scraping rhythm, like nails dragging over stone. Then came a breath, slow and uneven, not quite human, deep and labored as if something inside was struggling to stay alive. A cold wave of fear washed over Amos, rooting him to the spot. He pressed his back against the rough wood of the barn and forced himself to think. This was no ordinary root cellar. The moon cast pale light over the field, flickering through the skeletal branches of nearby trees. Amos's skin prickled with unease. Every instinct screamed to run, and he did, sprinting back toward the village with the chill of the cellar's secret clawing at his mind. Later that evening, Amos sat across from Silas Glick in the elder's dimly lit study. The scent of old leather and burning candle wax hung thick in the air. Amos's hands shook as he recounted the day's events, voice low and tense. "There's something down there," he said, eyes wide with unease. "And it ain't no root cellar." Silas's fingers drummed lightly against the worn cover of the town record book, the only sound in the dimly lit room besides the slow tick of an old clock hanging crooked on the wall. His gaze was fixed, distant yet focused, as if the weight of years pressed down on him like the heavy wooden beams above. The flicker of candlelight cast long shadows across his lined face, deepening the hollows beneath his eyes. Amos watched quietly, the unease between them thickening with every passing second. The silence stretched taut until Silas finally exhaled, a slow breath that seemed to carry the burden of his decision. Without a word, Silas rose and crossed to a small drawer beneath his desk. His hand trembled slightly, not from age, but from something far heavier, something unspoken. He withdrew a cold, iron key, worn and darkened with time. Amos's eyes narrowed as he took in the metal artifact, unfamiliar yet strangely significant. "This belonged to Sheriff Cranford," Silas said, voice low, edged with the gravity of history. He set the key on the desk between them. "He gave it to me the day he left town. Told me that if the Stoltz mystery ever stirred again, I'd know what to do with it." His fingers traced the key's length reverently. "He said it opens a box buried under the old jail floor." The room seemed to shrink around them, the walls closing in as the past pressed forward with a heavy weight. Amos swallowed hard, a chill running down his spine despite the faint warmth of the room. "The jailhouse," he murmured, almost to himself. "That place hasn't seen life in years." Night came swiftly, the sky a deep canvas of ink and stars, as Amos and Silas made their way to the jailhouse on the edge of town. The building loomed in the moonlight, an ancient relic cloaked in vines that crawled like dark veins over cracked bricks. The air was thick with the scent of decay and forgotten secrets. Every step on the gravel driveway echoed sharply, breaking the stillness that had settled over Fair Hollow for so long. Amos's breath came in shallow bursts. His heart hammered in rhythm with the crunch of dry leaves beneath their boots. They pushed open the heavy door, its rusty hinges protesting with a screech that sliced through the night like a warning. Inside, dust motes floated lazily in the pale beam of their flashlights. The air was stale, touched with the mustiness of mold and memories left to rot. Their footsteps disturbed decades of silence as they moved cautiously through the darkened corridors, the walls seeming to close in with every step. In a shadowed corner near the old holding cell, Silas found the loose floorboard he'd suspected. With effort, they pried it up, revealing a small cavity beneath. Amos's fingers trembled as he reached inside and lifted out a battered lockbox, its iron clasp stiff with rust. The weight of the box felt heavier than its size suggested, as if burdened by the secrets it held. They gathered around a rickety table in the old sheriff's office. Silas fumbled with the key, the metal cold and unforgiving. With a sharp click, the lock released. The box creaked open, revealing yellowed letters tied with faded ribbon, a black and white photograph, and a leather-bound journal, each item soaked with the passage of time and the sorrow of truth. Amos picked up the photograph first. The three Stoltz brothers stood side by side, their faces youthful and hopeful. Yet there was an unsettling figure beside them, a man neither he nor Silas recognized. His eyes were sharp and unreadable, his presence a silent enigma captured forever on the fragile paper. Silas unrolled a letter, the ink faded but still legible. His voice was hushed, weighted with unease as he read aloud. The letter spoke of a shadow lurking beneath the surface of Fair Hollow, an illicit world of moonshine runners, but darker and more insidious than anyone had imagined. Human trafficking whispered in coded phrases, underground dealings masked by the town's veneer of peace, and hints at a cult-like presence operating in the shadows. Amos felt a cold dread coil in his stomach. The journal, with its scrawled entries in Cranford's messy script, painted a grim picture. The sheriff had been relentless, chasing whispers and half-truths, piecing together a puzzle too dangerous for one man alone. Silas's hands shook slightly as he turned to the final entry, dated just 2 days before Cranford's sudden departure from Fair Hollow. His voice faltered, raw with fear and urgency. I finally tracked down the cellar. The entrance leads somewhere else. A tunnel? Smells of damp and blood. I heard whispers below. Real or imagined, I don't know. But I won't go back alone. If anyone finds this, watch the barn, and don't trust the quiet ones. The words hung heavy between them, more than a warning, a plea. Amos swallowed hard, eyes darting to the photograph again, then to Silas. We need more than guesses, Silas said, voice steady but grim. We need proof, and I think it's under that cellar. His gaze bore into Amos's, the resolve unmistakable. Amos nodded slowly, the knot in his gut tightening. The sound he'd heard beneath that cellar, the scraping, the unnatural breathing, refused to leave his mind. And Levi's basket, held so carefully, almost reverently, like a secret too terrible to bear. Whatever's down there, Amos said quietly, I don't think it wants to stay hidden much longer. Amos tightened his grip on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the thick darkness of the cellar. The cold air was heavy, damp with the scent of earth and old stone, biting at his skin through his worn jacket. The metal door groaned behind them as he and Jacob stepped inside, their footsteps echoing softly on the slick stone steps. Amos's heart hammered in his chest, each beat loud in the silence. He glanced at Jacob, whose jaw was clenched tight, eyes sharp and steady. Jacob didn't scare easily, but even he looked tense. The stairs stretched deeper than Amos had imagined, winding down into a narrow tunnel that seemed to swallow the light. Moisture dripped from the ceiling, splattering onto their jackets and boots. The walls closed in, rough and cold, as they descended step by step. The air grew colder still, pressing against their lungs, sharp and thin like ice. Amos swallowed hard, fighting the urge to turn back. He couldn't, not now, not after what they might find. At the bottom, the tunnel split into 2 paths. Amos trained his flashlight left first, revealing a cramped chamber filled with rusted hooks hanging crookedly from the walls and broken wooden crates stacked unevenly. A thick layer of dust covered everything, disturbed only by a few scattered leaves drifting in from the surface. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. It was a forgotten place, abandoned and hollow. Turning to the right path, Amos felt a chill deepen in his bones. The passage narrowed further, and the beam of his light danced over rough wooden planks barely holding together, forming a gate that sagged at its hinges. He reached out with a trembling hand and pushed the gate open with a creak that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. Inside, 3 small cots stood in a neat row. Each was covered with folded clothes, worn boots placed carefully at the foot, and a water jug resting nearby. On the middle cot, a Bible lay open, its pages yellowed and delicate. Amos crouched and traced a finger over the name carved deep into the leather cover. Micah. His breath hitched, a quiet ache blooming in his chest. Jacob's voice broke the silence, low and cautious. They were here. Amos nodded, swallowing down the tightness in his throat. Someone kept them here, for a time. His eyes scanned the room, lingering on the careful arrangement of the belongings. Whoever had done this had treated it with respect or fear. A sudden noise shattered the fragile quiet. From above, heavy footsteps thudded against the forest floor, growing louder, deliberate. Amos and Jacob exchanged a quick glance, eyes wide with alarm. Without a word, they killed their flashlights, plunging into total darkness. Their breaths came shallow and quick, hearts thudding so loud it was all they could hear. The footsteps paused just outside, the crunch of gravel sharp in the cold air. Then, after a tense moment, they retreated, fading back into the whispering woods. Amos felt his muscles tense, ready to bolt, but he stayed still, barely daring to breathe. Minutes dragged on, stretched thin by fear and silence. Neither man dared move or speak until finally, 10 full minutes passed. Slowly, Amos flicked his flashlight back on, revealing Jacob's pale, sweaty face illuminated by the weak beam. "We need to get out of here," Jacob whispered, voice tight, "before whoever that was comes back with company." They moved swiftly but carefully, closing the gate behind them with a soft thud. The climb back up the stone stairs was slow and silent, shadows pressing in from every side. Outside, the gray sky hung low, the wind tugging at their jackets and carrying the faint rustle of leaves like ghostly whispers. As they stepped back into the light of day, Amos locked the metal door behind them with trembling hands. His mind was heavy, weighed down by what they had seen and what they hadn't. The cots, the boots, the Bibles. This place wasn't a prison, no. It wasn't meant for punishment, but for waiting. Waiting for what, though? That question echoed relentlessly in his mind. Jacob's voice was breathless, raw with shock and disbelief. "They were alive," he said. "At least for a while." Amos didn't speak. He was thinking of the Bibles, the boots, the careful arrangement of those cots. "That cellar wasn't a prison," he muttered. "It was a holding place, a waiting room. But waiting for what?" Silas flipped the worn page of Cranford's journal again, his finger tracing the faded sketch, as if hoping it would reveal more secrets. The drawing was crude but unmistakable. 3 rings nested within one another, pierced diagonally by a single nail. He frowned, leaning closer, his breath fogging the brittle paper. "This," he said softly. "This mark, it was carved above the cellar door." Jacob Grentz, standing nearby with arms crossed and brows knit tight, studied the sketch with a sudden sharpness in his eyes. "That's the same mark on the old chapel door near Split Rock," he said, voice low but firm. "I've seen it 100 times as a kid. Local dare, no one went inside for long. They say it's cursed." Amos King, whose hands still bore traces of soot from his forge, leaned in. "The chapel's been abandoned for decades," he added, his tone a mix of curiosity and unease. "Not a place for a Sunday service anymore. Just old wood and broken glass." Silas nodded slowly, the weight of the discovery settling like a stone in his gut. "If this symbol is on both the cellar and the chapel," he murmured, "there's a connection we need to follow." The 3 men set out mid-morning, the sun cutting through the dense canopy as they made their way along the narrow dirt road toward Split Rock. The forest seemed to close in tighter here, the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves thick in the air. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on gravel and the occasional call of a distant crow. After nearly an hour, the chapel emerged through the trees, a skeleton of a building, its weather-beaten roof sagging like tired shoulders, windows shattered and gaping like empty eye sockets. Vines crawled up the cracked stone walls, clutching the structure as if trying to pull it back into the earth. A faint chill prickled Silas's neck as they approached the heavy wooden door. There, above the threshold, etched into the rotting frame and fading with time, was the symbol 3 intertwined rings pierced by a nail. The lines were rough but clear enough to confirm their suspicion. Amos reached out, his rough fingers brushing over the grooves, and shivered despite the morning warmth. They stepped inside carefully. The air was stale and thick with dust, motes swirling in the shafts of light that pierced the shattered roof. The pews, once polished, were coated in grime and scattered with bird droppings. Yet the altar at the front was startlingly clean, almost as if someone had tended to it recently. On the altar rested a simple wooden box, its surface worn smooth by age but locked tight. Jacob's fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of photographs, stacked unevenly but meticulously arranged. One by one they spread them out on the altar. Dozens of black and white images, faded at the edges but still sharp enough to see the faces staring back at them. Young men, farm hands with sun-weathered skin, carpenters with rough hands, schoolboys with wide eyes. Each one labeled on the back with a date, scrawled in a neat but hurried hand. Amos's voice caught as he picked out 3 familiar faces near the center of the pile. "Elijah, Abram, and Micah," he whispered. "Our boys." His throat tightened. The photographs were old, worn, like silent witnesses to a terrible history. Jacob flipped several over. Many of the dates were crossed out in thick black ink, as if marking the end of something. The final photograph lay at the bottom, uncrossed. It showed a man standing in a field, the clothes modern, the face younger, but unmistakably Levi Wren. A chill swept through Silas. "He's not the one taking them," he said quietly, eyes narrowing. "He's the next one in line." Amos's jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening on the altar. "What does that mean? He's a victim, too? Or a willing part of this?" Jacob's voice was steady but heavy with dread. Either way, the cycle's far from over. They gathered the photographs carefully, their silence thick with unspoken questions. As they left the chapel, the wind sighed through the broken windows, carrying with it a whispered warning. Whatever shadow had crept into Fairhollow's past did not begin with Levi. He wasn't the monster. He was the offering. Levi Wren jolted awake, the sharp clatter of hooves pounding through the stillness of the night slicing the silence like a knife. His heart thudded heavily beneath his ribs as he swung his legs over the edge of the bed, cold wood creaking beneath his weight. The moon hung low, a pale sliver in the sky, barely lighting the porch outside. Yet there, swaying gently from the weathered post, hung a sack, its coarse burlap stained dark with a sticky substance that caught the faint silver light. Levi's breath caught in his throat. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped onto the porch, the worn boards groaning underfoot. The heavy scent of iron and something raw and metallic filled the air, prickling at the back of his neck. His eyes narrowed as he inched closer, fingers trembling as they brushed the sack aside. Inside, the limp form of a goat lay twisted, its throat cleanly slit, the blood pooling in a dark stain on the rough fabric. A chill slid down Levi's spine when he noticed the strange symbol carved deep into the goat's hide. 3 interlocking rings pierced by a nail. The same mark he'd seen in the chapel, the cellar, and burned into his very life. He did not shout. He did not call for help. Instead, Levi's jaw clenched, lips pressed tight as his eyes darted around the shadows, aware that he was not alone. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a figure watched, silent, still, unseen. Jonas Stoltz, the grief-stricken father who had borne his loss quietly for 11 years, but whose mourning had lately transformed into something colder, sharper. The next morning dawned pale and gray, the mist hanging low over the fields as Jonas approached Amos King's forge. His face was carved with lines deeper than time, eyes burning with a fierce determination no one had seen before. "I want to see the cellar," he said, voice steady but brittle with the weight of years. Amos hesitated, the usual warmth replaced by a flicker of dread. "Jonas, that place." Jonas cut him off, stepping closer, eyes locked on Amos's. "I was their father. I should have gone down there years ago." There was no argument in his tone, only a solemn command. Amos swallowed hard, nodding, knowing resistance was futile. Together, they made their way back to the woods, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The metal door groaned open beneath their hands, the chill of the cellar's breath rising to meet them. Jonas descended without hesitation, each step measured and resolute, the years of silent waiting shaping his every movement. His lantern cast long, flickering shadows that danced across the cold stone walls, illuminating the cots lined up with eerie precision. Jonas's eyes fell upon the worn Bible resting on the middle cot, the name Micah carved faintly inside the cover. He knelt, fingertips brushing the leather softly, as if trying to coax the past itself to speak. No tears came, only a hard, steady resolve. Then his gaze drifted to the back of the room, where a wooden panel sealed tightly shut seemed to beckon with a quiet menace. He rose and approached the panel, pressing his hand against the wood. Felt hollow, like a secret waiting just beyond reach. "There's more," he whispered, voice rough with something between hope and fear. They were hiding something. Amos joined him, and together they pried at the edges of the panel. It gave way with a grudging creak, revealing a narrow tunnel, its rough walls dug by hand, damp and smelling faintly of earth and something darker, something older. They stepped inside, the air growing heavier, colder, as if the tunnel itself exhaled centuries of silence. At the far end, Jonas's lantern revealed a single wooden chair, chained firmly to the stone floor. The armrests bore deep claw marks, gouges jagged and raw. Embedded in the wood were shards of broken human nails, silent echoes of desperate struggle. On the back wall, a carving streaked in dried blood glowed ominously in the flickering light. Let them sleep beneath the bone. If that moment sent chills down your spine, don't stay silent. Subscribe and become a member, because unveiling hidden truths requires courage and heart. Night had fallen heavy and quiet over Fairhollow when Jonas Stoltz led the small group to the worn wooden door of Levi Wren's farmhouse. The sky was clouded, smothering the moonlight, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and fading leaves. Behind Jonas, Amos, Jacob, Silas, and 2 other men followed, their footsteps muffled by the soft soil. Each carried the weight of years lost, of sons and brothers vanished into the shadows beneath their feet. The tension between them was taut, like a string pulled tight, ready to snap. Jonas's knuckles rapped sharply against the rough-hewn door. It creaked open, revealing Levi standing there, his face drawn and eyes wary. He seemed smaller in the dim light, his shoulders hunched, as if the weight of his secret bent him inward. Levi's gaze flicked over the men behind Jonas, registering the grave purpose in their stance. "You know about the cellar," Levi said, voice flat, almost defeated. There was no anger, only exhaustion, as though he carried a burden too heavy for any man. Silas stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Not everything, but enough." His eyes met Levi's, searching for truth behind the quiet admission. Levi sighed deeply and stepped aside, motioning them into the cramped kitchen. The faded wallpaper peeled in patches, and the flickering candle on the table cast long shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls. He sat heavily in a creaking chair, fingers trembling slightly as he opened a cluttered drawer. From it, he pulled out a worn notebook, its leather cover cracked and softened by years of use. He laid the book on the table, the soft thud breaking the stillness. "This," Levi said, voice low, "is what I live with." He flipped through pages dense with names, dates, and cryptic rituals written in careful script. "My father started it. Said it was a pact made long ago to keep something beneath the well from rising. 1 life every 11 years. That's the price." Jonas leaned in, eyes narrowing. "But it wasn't kept." "No," Levi replied, voice barely a whisper. "They got greedy. The men before me, before my father, started offering more. Not just the chosen. The cycle was broken. The Stoltz brothers, they weren't meant to be sacrificed. They were punished." The word hung in the air like a curse. "Punished for what?" Jonas asked, voice low, heavy with pain. Levi's gaze darkened, a flicker of something hard and bitter crossing his features. "For trying to burn the well." A cold silence settled. Amos shifted uncomfortably. "They knew," he said quietly. "They tried to stop it." Jonas's hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight. He stared at Levi, searching for answers. "Where are they now?" Levi looked away, then back with eyes that held both fear and sorrow. "I don't know, but I can show you who does." Levi led the group around the back of his property. the chill of early evening clinging to the air as shadows stretched long across the overgrown grass. The well stood there like a forgotten sentinel, its weathered stone walls lined carefully in a circle, worn smooth by decades of neglect. A rusted iron grate sealed its mouth, bolted shut with a thick chain that was looped several times and fastened with a heavy padlock. The metal was aged and pitted with rust, as if it had never been disturbed since the Clemens family vanished all those years ago. Levi's voice was low but steady as he spoke. This hasn't been opened since they disappeared. If what my father said is true, that the Stoltz brothers were punished, then their bones are likely down there. Jonas stood rigid, his jaw tight, eyes dark with a storm of grief and rage. His fingers clenched into fists at his sides. "Open it," he growled, voice rough with emotion, the command less a question than a demand. Levi took a hesitant step backward, shaking his head slightly. "I can't. If I do, it calls them," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something unseen to stir in the woods behind them. The weight of the moment pressed down on the small group. The cold evening breeze seemed to pause, the usual rustling of leaves silenced as if nature itself held its breath. Silas stepped forward, his face set with grim determination. He lifted a crowbar from his belt and addressed the group, voice calm but resolute. "We've come too far to turn back now." Jacob's strong hands gripped the iron grate as he wedged the crowbar beneath the rusted bolts. The metal groaned in protest as they forced the chains apart, the links scraping against one another in a harsh, metallic chorus. A sudden gust surged upward the moment the last bolt gave way, a wave of air so cold and unnatural that it cut through their clothes like icy fingers from some dark, forgotten place. The grate lifted slowly, revealing a yawning pit of darkness below. A wooden ladder, slick with moisture and age, disappeared into the blackness, inviting yet foreboding. The beam of Jonas's flashlight trembled slightly as he aimed it downward. No one spoke. The silence was thick and heavy. Jacob was the first to volunteer, dropping cautiously onto the top rung. The ladder creaked beneath his weight as he descended into the void. One by one, Silas, Amos, Jonas, and finally Levi followed, the narrow shaft swallowing them into cold shadows. The stone walls closed in tight, slick with dampness, dripping faintly with water that echoed softly in the confined space. Their breaths came out in shallow puffs, mingling with the stale, earthy smell of limestone and decay. When they reached the bottom, the flashlight beams swept across a circular chamber carved carefully from pale limestone. The air was thick, cold, and heavy with the scent of dust and something older, something forgotten. Alcoves lined the walls, each holding piles of bones, some small and brittle, others larger and still clothed in rotting fabric. The bones seemed arranged, not scattered, a grim display of lives reduced to fragments. In the center of the chamber rested a stone basin, ancient and carved with intricate designs faded by time. It was filled with thick, black water that absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. Jonas stepped forward slowly, his boots echoing hollowly against the stone floor. As he approached, the flashlight flickered, once, twice, casting fleeting shadows that danced unsettlingly across the walls. A soft whisper seeped through the silence, a voice like a distant memory, childlike yet hollow. "We tried to run, but they watched from under." The words seemed to come from the very stone itself, curling around them like cold fingers. Amos's breath caught in his throat. His eyes widened as he stared at the basin. The surface began to ripple slowly, as if something beneath stirred awake after a long slumber. Jonas froze, every muscle taut with a mixture of fear and sorrow. Suddenly, from the depths of the water, 3 pale objects emerged, floating upward like ghosts released from some ancient grave. They were the carved name tags from the Stoltz brothers' hats, AS, and MS, waterlogged, swollen. Their wood cracked and peeling. Jonas collapsed to his knees, the weight of loss pressing down on him like a physical blow. Tears welled up, but he did not cry aloud. Silas bent down beside him, voice barely above a whisper, trembling with the weight of what they had uncovered. They were sacrificed to something old, something deeper than men. They climbed out of the well's depths in heavy silence. The cold from the chamber clung to their clothes and skin like a second layer, an unwelcome reminder of the darkness they just left behind. Above them, the night hung thick and oppressive, shadows swallowing the stars until only a faint, dull glow remained. Levi stood apart, his eyes glazed and unfocused, staring at the jagged edge of the open well as if trying to see beyond the darkness it swallowed. His voice broke the silence, low and hollow. "It's awake now. The cycle's been broken. There's no offering this time." Silas spun to face him, the firelight casting harsh shadows over his lined face. His voice was sharp, the years of burden and loss fueling the edge in his tone. "Then we end it. All of it. No more cycles. No more sacrifices. We close this chapter for good." The group moved swiftly through the night, the weight of the discovery pressing on their shoulders. At the old meeting hall, a weathered building that had seen better days, Silas gathered the men. Their faces were etched with exhaustion, grief, and something harder, resolve. No one spoke as Silas spread out the worn maps and scattered the faded photographs. The cellar, the chapel, the hidden tunnels, and now the well, each piece a thread in a tapestry woven from centuries of fear and silence. "Look at this," Silas said, his finger tracing the lines on the map. "It's been right under our feet all along. Our town, our families, entwined in this darkness. Brothers, sons, neighbors, all lost. And for what? A pact to keep something beneath the well at bay." His voice cracked, but he pushed on. "Names we read today, Elijah, Abram, Micah, and so many others. We've been carrying this burden silently for generations." Jonas stepped forward then, the years marked in his stooped shoulders but the fire still burning fierce in his eyes. He lifted the sealed jar, the murky water inside shimmering faintly under the flickering lantern light. "This is what's left of my boys." His voice broke with grief. "But I won't let it take anyone else." A heavy stillness settled over the room, thick with shared pain and unspoken promises. The men looked to one another, each knowing what had to be done, but uncertain if they could bear the weight of the final act. Finally, Silas cleared his throat, his tone steady despite the storm within. "At sunrise, we seal the well forever. We collapse the tunnels, burn the chapel, break every chain that binds this horror to Fair Hollow." Outside, the wind howled, rattling the old windows. The night seemed to hold its breath. But then the sky shifted. A deep, unnatural crimson bled across the horizon, spreading like fire. Animals stirred in terror, horses thrashed in their stalls, their panic filling the night with uneasy sounds. Even the trees seemed to shudder in the fading light. Amos grabbed Jacob's arm. "We need to check on Levi. Now." They ran through the dark streets, their boots pounding against dirt and gravel, the urgency driving their breath ragged. When they reached Levi's house, a cold emptiness greeted them. The door was ajar, swinging slowly in the wind. Inside, no sign of the man who had haunted their nights for so long. On the kitchen table lay a single piece of paper, the edges curled and stained. Amos picked it up with trembling hands. Written in careful, deliberate letters were the words, "It must be fed, or it will take everything." At first light, the group stood clustered near the well, the heavy barrels of lime and rubble resting against their shoulders and at their feet. The morning air was crisp, biting at exposed skin, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and old wood. Silas's weathered hands trembled slightly as he lifted a barrel, eyes flickering between the cracked stone rim and the dark abyss below. Jonas stood rigid, his jaw clenched tight, the weight of years pressing down on him like the chill in the air. Around them, the others moved with slow determination, methodically dumping the lime and rubble into the well's yawning mouth. Each thud echoed in the stillness, mingling with the creak of settling stones and the soft crunch of debris hitting the cold water deep below. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the rattling as the barrels emptied their burdens. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the ground beneath their feet began to shudder, a low, unsettling tremor that rippled outwards like a silent warning. Cracks spidered across the well's edge, thin fissures snaking along the stones. The air grew colder, thick with an ancient sorrow that settled deep in their bones. Jonas stepped back, eyes wide, heart hammering as the well's stone lip began to sink, sliding downwards with a slow, deliberate hunger, swallowing itself stone by stone. From the depths below, a scream erupted, piercing and raw, neither fully human nor animal. It clawed at the edges of sanity, a sound born from pain and rage and something far older than any man's grief. The group froze, breaths caught in their throats, the wails twisting around their minds, threatening to drown hope in despair. Suddenly, movement shattered the silence. From the shadowed tree-line emerged Levi Wren, his frame hunched under the weight of a struggling figure. The boy, no more than 10, was bound tightly with rough rope, tears streaking his dirt-smudged face as he sobbed quietly. Levi's expression was grim, eyes sunken but fierce with resolve. "I found him wandering near the school," Levi announced, voice steady but edged with desperation. "He'll stop it. One more. Just one more." His words hung heavy in the air, a cruel promise that chilled every man present. Jonas's eyes blazed with fury and disbelief. "No!" he roared, lunging forward without hesitation. His hands slammed into Levi's skull, fists driven by years of pain and a father's fierce protection. Levi crumpled to the ground, blood seeping from cracked lips as he coughed harshly. "You will not do this again," Jonas growled, voice thick with anger. Around them, Amos and Jacob moved swiftly, pulling the boy from Levi's grasp, shielding him from further harm. The child's sobs grew louder, mingling with the fading cries from the well. Levi wiped the blood from his mouth, eyes wild with a haunted understanding. "It won't stop," he gasped. "You don't get it. It eats memory. It eats time. You'll forget this in weeks. In months, no one will remember who the Stoltz brothers were." His gaze flicked between the men, searching for comprehension, acceptance, or perhaps pity, but finding only steely resolve. Jonas dropped to his knees beside Levi, voice raw but unyielding. "Then I'll carve their names into every tree in this forest." His hands clenched into fists, knuckles white as he imagined the endless task ahead, the stubborn defiance it represented. Silas, standing firm despite the chill gnawing at his bones, struck a match with deliberate calm. "And we'll bury what's left of you with it." The flickering flame reflected in his eyes, a light born of finality and fierce hope. Together, they poured the fuel, the liquid scent sharp and biting in the cold morning air. Flames roared to life, crackling and licking hungrily as the fire consumed the well's shattered edges. The ground trembled beneath their feet, a primal shaking that seemed to echo from the earth's very heart. Yet the stones held fast, the fissures sealed by the consuming blaze. The anguished cries from below slowly faded, swallowed by the rising smoke and the crackling inferno. Around the firelight, the men stood silent, watching, breathing in the heavy mix of ash and sorrow. And for the first time in 11 years, it was quiet. The morning light filtered weakly through the fog, casting long, trembling shadows across the fair hollow streets. Jonas Stoltz sat on the porch of his weathered farmhouse, the heavy wooden bench creaking beneath his weight as his eyes scanned the gnarled oak trees that bordered his land. His hands, worn from years of hard labor, clutched a Bible so faded and fragile it seemed ready to crumble. He turned the pages slowly, searching for something he knew should be there, Micah's name, carved carefully on the edge of the leather cover. But when his fingers traced the spot, the name was gone. Just a pale, empty space stared back at him, mocking his memory. Jonas's breath hitched. A cold knot tightened in his chest, squeezing the breath from his lungs. How could this happen? He flipped through the pages again, disbelief spreading like ice. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the morning stillness. "Not like this. Not Micah." The words felt hollow, empty, like the absence was growing deeper, more complete than any wound he had ever known. Inside the village, the quiet was different now. It was not the calm that came with peace but something heavier, a weight pressing down on minds and memories. Amos King sat at his desk in the blacksmith shop, staring at a leather-bound journal. His thick fingers hovered over the pages, hesitant. When he dared to turn a page, the words faded before his eyes, dissolving into blank, featureless sheets. He slammed the book shut, frustration and fear tightening his jaw. "I wrote all this down," he muttered, voice rough with dread. "And now, it's nothing." His apprentice, a young man named Caleb, watched from the doorway, eyes wide but silent. Amos ran a hand through his graying hair and stood, pacing the cramped room filled with the smell of iron and coal. "What's happening to us?" he asked, though no answer came. Outside, the faint rustle of leaves sounded like whispers, teasing him with things half-remembered. At the edge of town, Silas Glick blinked awake in the cold light of dawn, sweat beading on his forehead. His mind clawed at a foggy edge, struggling to grasp the faces and names that had once been clear. He reached for a photograph on his bedside table, only to find the image smudged and distorted as if smeared by invisible hands. He swallowed hard, confused. "Who is Jonas?" he breathed, a question that stabbed through his fading certainty. The names and faces of his lifelong friends were slipping away like shadows at dusk, and with them, the story of the Stoltz brothers. In the town square, Jacob Grentz stood frozen, staring down at an old black-and-white photograph pinned to the notice board. The image showed a group of men, some known neighbors, others long gone. But the faces were marred, smudged and blurred as if someone had scrubbed them with soot. His chest tightened, and a cold sweat prickled at his neck. "No," he said under his breath, voice breaking. "This can't be happening." Jacob gripped the edges of the photo, knuckles white, as if holding on could stop the erasure. He glanced toward the forest, where the ancient oaks stretched their limbs skyward like silent sentinels. Only Jonas remained untouched by this creeping forgetfulness. Every evening, by the fading light of a flickering lantern, Jonas would retreat into the woods, a carving knife in hand. His body bent over bark and stone as he etched names deep and raw: Elijah, Abram, Micah. The grooves bled sap, thick and amber, running down the trunks like tears. "I won't forget," Jonas murmured each night, voice steady but laced with pain. "Even if I have to say it every day, till I die." Amos found his way to Jonas's door one damp morning, the weight of uncertainty heavy in his steps. He held the same faded Bible Jonas had been reading, but where Micah's name should have been carved, only a blank space stared back. "Jonas?" Amos's voice was thick with sorrow. "Look at this." Jonas took the Bible gently, eyes closing for a moment as if bracing himself. He ran his fingers slowly over the empty spot, then lifted his gaze to the towering oaks outside, their trunks scarred with fresh carvings. "As long as one of us remembers," he said softly, "they're still alive." Jonas Stoltz's hands trembled as he pressed his carving knife against the rough bark of the old oak tree. The sun had just risen, casting a weak golden light through the thinning leaves, but the air still held the crisp chill of early morning. His breath came in shallow puffs, misting briefly before vanishing into the silence. Each stroke of the blade tore into the wood, deepening the grooves where the names of his sons, Elijah, Abram, Micah, were etched. The cuts were jagged, raw, and sap oozed thick and dark from the wounds. It smelled strange today, metallic, sharp, as if the tree itself was bleeding iron instead of resin. Jonas paused, wiping sweat from his brow, his eyes lingering on the swollen letters dripping with sap. He traced the names with a calloused finger, feeling the sticky warmth, a futile attempt to hold onto something slipping away. His body ached, but he could not stop. Each morning, the ritual kept the memories alive. The carvings were his defiance against the void swallowing everything he loved. Yet beneath his steady hands, a terrible shift was creeping, not just inside him, but across Fair Hollow. Jonas could feel it like a shadow stretching over the town, invisible but heavy. He pulled his coat tighter around his thin frame and turned his gaze toward the village. Smoke rose faintly from chimneys, and the distant sound of church bells echoed through the valley. But something was wrong. The streets felt emptier than usual, voices quieter. The hollow ache of loss was growing, spreading like a sickness no medicine could cure. At the schoolhouse, a fresh-faced teacher, Mr. Bennett, stared blankly at his attendance sheet. "Where have they gone?" he muttered, eyes scanning names that once belonged to lively boys. Half the desks sat empty. Their occupants vanished from memory like whispers lost in the wind. At the sheriff's office, Deputy Harlan rifled through stacks of files, frustration creasing his brow. Case after case listed only unknown male. No details, no clues, just shadows on paper. Jonas knew the truth. Memories were not fading. They were being ripped away in chunks, torn clean from the minds of those who once held them. The town's history was unraveling, and no one seemed able to stop it. Back in his modest home, Jonas sat at a worn wooden table cluttered with notebooks and scraps of paper. His fingers trembled as he scribbled furiously, trying to capture every fragment before it vanished. But the ink fought him, words blurred and smudged like wet paint, letters bleeding into nothingness. He stuffed the journals into a locked chest, yet each morning, some pages woke empty, stripped of meaning overnight. He ran a hand through his graying hair, exhaustion weighing heavy on his shoulders. How do you fight forgetting when it's a thief in the night, stealing what's yours without a trace? His voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. Every corner of his home had become a shrine to memory. Carved initials ES, AS, MS marked the beams overhead. The backs of chairs bore the names etched with shaking hands. Even the chipped plates he ate from held faint scratches, reminders etched by time and grief. Jonas's world had shrunk to these symbols, a fortress built of wood and sorrow. A sharp knock shattered the silence. Jonas stiffened, heart pounding. He wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, he rose and opened the door to find Amish standing there, pale and shaken. His eyes were wide, filled with a mix of fear and urgency. In his hand, he clutched a photograph, the edges curled and worn. "Jonas," Amish said, voice trembling. "You need to see this." Jonas took the photo, fingers brushing against the cold paper. It was the group, himself, Silas, Jacob, Levi, standing outside the chapel on that day they uncovered the photographs. But the image was wrong. The others were faded, barely more than silhouettes, blurred shadows with no distinct features. Only Jonas remained clear, solid as ever. "They're disappearing," Amish said, barely audible. "Like they never existed." Jonas's gaze snapped back to the oak tree outside, the dark sap glistening in the morning light. A cold shiver ran down his spine as the metallic scent filled the air again. The town was losing its past, piece by piece, and with it the truth about what had happened. Jonas clenched his fists, determination hardening inside him. If memories could be stolen, then he would be the one to guard them, no matter the cost. He looked once more at the tree, where the names of his sons bled like wounds in the bark. The sap was darker now. It smelled metallic. Jonas's hands trembled as the cold steel of the carving knife pressed against his forearm. The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a silence so complete it swallowed every breath he took. His lantern flickered weakly, casting shadows that danced like ghosts among the gnarled branches overhead. He was seated at the edge of the old well's pit, now little more than a shallow hollow choked with weeds and scattered stones, and every ounce of resolve in him steeled against the ache twisting deep inside his chest. He took a slow, shuddering breath and whispered the names he could no longer afford to lose. "Elijah," he said, voice barely louder than a rustle of wind. His lips tightened as he recalled the boy's warm laugh, the way it could fill a quiet room with light. "Abram," he continued, swallowing the lump lodged in his throat, thinking of stubborn hands that shaped wood with patient care. "Micah," his voice cracked, fingers curling around the worn bundle of their belongings beside him. "Your crooked tooth and bright eyes, never forgotten." The sky above began to pale as the first faint threads of dawn stretched across the horizon, bleeding soft reds into the deep navy of night. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat pounding like a drum beneath his ribs. Jonas's trembling fingers found the blade again. A sharp sting pierced the skin, hot and raw, and he winced but did not pull away. Drawing carefully, painfully, he etched the first letter of each son's name into his flesh. An E, then an A, then an M. Each letter carved with deliberate care, as if marking a sacred promise onto his very being. "This," he said through clenched teeth, voice low and fierce, "you cannot take." The woods held their breath. The wind stilled, and even the distant calls of night birds ceased, as if the world itself awaited what would come next. From the darkness, movement stirred. Shadows gathered at the edges of the clearing, twisting and coiling like smoke curling from a dying fire. Jonas's eyes snapped toward them, wide and unblinking, his jaw clenched, hands tightening into fists. The weight of years of grief, fear, and unyielding love pressed down on him like the earth beneath his knees. "You can eat names," he said, voice rising with quiet fury, "but you cannot eat love." The shadows paused, as if listening. The air grew colder still, pressing in on Jonas's skin, but he did not flinch. He sat upright, shoulders squared, a silent sentinel guarding memories no darkness could claim. For long moments, the forest held him in its grasp, the line between past and present blurred beneath the pale glow of the fading stars. When dawn finally broke fully, spilling golden light across the land, the woods seemed to exhale. The shadows slipped back into the hollows and crevices, retreating like tides pulled away by an unseen moon. Jonas was gone. In his place, near the crumbled well, the 3 straw hats hung neatly from the low branches of an ancient oak. Their straw faded and worn, yet unmistakably familiar. Beneath them, carved deep and deliberate into the bark, were words etched by steady, loving hands. They were loved. They are not forgotten. Not by me. The morning air was still, the usual chorus of birds and rustling leaves conspicuously absent. Even the wind seemed hesitant, as if reluctant to disturb the solemn quiet that had settled over Fair Hollow. The townspeople, awakening to this strange silence, could feel the weight of it pressing on their hearts, a quiet that was different from the ordinary calm. For the first time in over a decade, Fair Hollow remained whole. Quiet, still, but whole. The kind of stillness that dares you to forget, and warns you never to try. The hats tell a story lost to time, but the truth is waiting. If you stand for answers, justice, and hope, hit subscribe and join the channel. Together we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional, created to explore themes of mystery, loss, and the search for truth. Its purpose is to engage viewers and inspire reflection on family and faith.